to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Dame Annabelle Rankin was the first Queensland woman elected to federal parliament in 1947 and only the second woman elected to the Senate after Labor's Dorothy Tangney. Despite women having the vote since 1902, it took until the 1940s for Australia to elect a woman to the federal parliament. But then in that decade, Australians elected 6 women, 4 of whom were from Menzies' Liberal Party. Joining me to discuss the remarkable story of Australia's second female senator, Annabelle Rankin, is Peter Sekuless. Peter is a Canberra-based writer who has been a press gallery journalist, a Commonwealth public servant and a government relations consultant. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Peter.
Welcome. Thank you very much indeed. Happy to be doing it.
Yeah, it's wonderful that you've written this book on Annabelle Rankin, which is one of the books in the Australian Biographical Monographs series that is published by Connor Court and is producing a great range of books on all sorts of Australian political leaders that we should know more about. And of course, we're very happy here at the Robert Menzies Institute that our own Zachary Gorman has written one on Joseph Cook, one of Australia's early prime ministers. But today we're talking about Annabelle Rankin, who is quite an incredible woman. And Peter, how did Annabelle Rankin get into politics? Because this is an amazing story against so many odds.
Yes, she was different from the other early women, that she didn't have any contemporary family connections or social or other, partly, of course, because she'd spent the years immediately before her election, which actually she was elected in 1946, but didn't take up her seat until 47.
Yeah.
You said she was 47, so the election was 46. I think they took a bit longer time in those days.
Indeed, you are right. Elected in September 46, but entered the federal parliament in July 47. So yes, let's set the record straight there. Thank you.
So she came quite literally out of uniform to stand for pre-selection. And one of the problems was, one of her great worries was, she didn't have, having been in the forces, having been in the army and wearing a uniform, she had to, oh my goodness, what am I going to wear? You know, a very, very womanly sort of thing, but which we're not supposed to dwell on. But she was always very aware of how she was dressed and how she looked, which was important. In fact, her father had been a Queensland MP, but he'd actually died in 1940, so there wasn't a strong connection. It came about because as part of her role with the Australian Women's Army Services, looking after women's welfare, that's the welfare of service women and including nurses, was to give talks in Brisbane and elsewhere in Queensland about the work they were doing and encouraging civilians to help in whatever way they could. At one of those talks, in the audience was a lawyer. At the time, he was a state member. His name was Charles Wanstall, and he went on to become the Chief Justice of Queensland. And he was quite active. It wasn't the Liberal Party then. It was still Queensland. You know, Queensland's always has to be different. What came after the Australian United Party in Queensland was called, on the Conservative side, but not the metropolitan, if you like, Conservative side, was called the QPP, the Queensland People's Party. And there was a bunch of young, quite progressive in their time, not progressive as we think of it now. And because when they actually selected for that, for 1946 Senate election, they didn't go back with the old-timers, of which there were many around. They actually elected, first on the ticket was a Catholic solicitor, which was quite, I know it seems funny now, but that was the religious divide was pretty strong, and particularly in Queensland, all the Labor politicians' names had Irish names. So they put, first on the ticket was Neil O'Sullivan, who was a Catholic solicitor, and second, a woman, which was very, very adventurous. But she had impressed Wanstall and the selectors, very forthright views, the way she expressed them, and she was a very engaging personality. So she didn't come through the normal route at all.
What I find fascinating too is how much she had travelled before she got into politics. I understand her father, who, as you say, was a member of Parliament in the Queensland Parliament, he had really encouraged her to travel, and she, after leaving school, went to China and Japan, to England, Scotland and Europe, and She was working in the slums in London, helping refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and in Gibraltar, she was witnessing the bombardment of the town of La Línea de la Concepción. I mean, she was quite an adventurous young lady.
She attributes it to her father, and it's possible he had two girls, and she hints at various times that maybe she treated them, and particularly her, who was the elder, very much as he would have a boy. But there was no question about the giving them a proper education. She was sent to Toowoomba to boarding school for secondary school, and then she was allowed to travel. It was seen as part of her education. But when that was finished, it was very much back home to a small mining town in country Queensland, inland from Maryborough, and she did things like helping out with the Sunday school and so on. And it was really only the voluntary jobs. Young ladies didn't sully their hands because they were quite a prominent family. They ran owners of a British coal mine. Her grandfather had given the land for the local Church of England church, their own pew. She sort of rode her pony to school. So they were quite well off. But as you say, allowing her to travel and encourage her to do all that overseas travel was quite unusual.
So she obviously is successful in this pre-selection for the Senate spot, coming in the number 2 spot after Neil O'Sullivan, you said. And
3 because the Country Party had number 1.
Apologies. So the number 2 spot for the Liberal Party, but number 3 in the ticket. In that pre-selection, I understand she ousted Harry Foll, who had led the party revolt against Robert Menzies in August 1941. So that would have also been quite controversial, I'm sure, at the time.
Oh, Foll was furious, but he only had himself to blame. Absolutely amazing. He was pretty old by that stage. He'd been a Gallipoli veteran. He'd been a minister in the nationalist government, in the 20s, the federal government. But he'd been living in Sydney. He'd been living in Sydney for years.
Right.
It does not go over well in Queensland.
No, that would have gone down very bad.
Living in the flesh pots of the south. How he seriously expected to be able to walk it in again. But as saying that was why. So that's why I was impressed with those Liberal pre-selectors. They were saying, well, no. And look at what they were facing at the time. It looked like Labor from shore to shore. In Queensland, Labor looked like it was there forever. They didn't get rid of them until the split of the 50s. And 43 hadn't looked good. The opposition was split. So it was quite brave of them. But Foll didn't go out unhappily. And he made very mutterings about it, that it was religious influence.
Oh,
so,
right.
Of course, he would. Yeah. Oh, yes. He wasn't so upset about Annabelle as he was about being replaced by a Catholic.
Indeed. Well, yes, of course, the sectarian tensions back then were pretty strong, weren't they? I really like this quote from Annabelle Rankin. I think she's interviewed by the Courier Mail about her pre-selection. And she says, I am proud and pleased at my selection. During the war, I met thousands of service women, and this will give me my chance to assist them in their rehabilitation. Senator Tangney and Dame Enid Lyons are the only 2 voices women have in Parliament. It is time the women had a greater say in the running of the country. Queensland women have been clamouring for years to have one of their sex representing them in the federal parliament. I offer my services.
Yes. I think it was that very clearly stated. She was obviously an engaging personality that got her there. Yes, it was her. It was definitely her efforts.
I mean, yeah, and she campaigned very well, I understand, through that Senate campaign, in 1946, as you corrected me. But, of course, the big problem for her as a woman was her marital status, wasn't it?
Absolutely. While women didn't seem to suffer from the same overt, unpleasantly sort of sexism that was more manifest, say, in the 60s and 70s, that was the business, where's your, why aren't you married? Women's places in the home, shouldn't you be married? She copped it all the time. And she wouldn't answer it. And in fact, never did so in public that I'm aware of, right. Although ultimately she allowed Enid Lyons to explain why she was never married. She had a fiancé who was killed in the war. Right. And so she would never speak of it. Otherwise, the only other evidence I've got of that is that she told some of her male colleagues in Canberra, particularly servicemen, because she venerated people who'd been in the services. And one of them, John Howes, who she was close with, she told him that she wasn't married. But yes, she copped it left, right and centre. And in fact, she didn't get married later. I think she was simply too busy with all the travel and so on. The opportunities weren't there.
It's interesting, though, she campaigned obviously so effectively in that first election that she won almost twice as many first preference votes as Neil O'Sullivan, the other Liberal on the ticket at that 46 election. So she, irrespective of her marital status, it doesn't seem to have done her much harm.
Although she didn't have the established political links, she had, partly through her army work and partly from early connections with organisations like the Girl Guides and the CWA, she had what in effect was a fantastic network. Her power base, which she never forgot and always stayed in touch with them, were with those women's organisations that were statewide. So wherever she went, whether she was going to the coastal towns or further inland, there would be a branch of the CWA, very often an organised Red Cross organisation, the Girl Guides. And of course, in those early years, she obviously had a huge links with the service, with the ex-service community, particularly the women. That's why she got 12,000 more than him in that. And Charles Porter, Charles Porter, who was the father of Gilla Porter and grandfather of Christian, who was the sort of the political agent in Queensland at the time, and is a bit inclined to exaggerate. He carries on that, she used to get 20,000 votes in her own right. Well, she never actually got 20,000 votes in her own right, but she did get 17,000 more personal votes. And apparently in that first election, you can track it back through the voting, she got quite a few Labor women voting for her as well.
But, I mean, as you said, that Labor did well at the 46 election, but the coalition was successful, of course, in Queensland, winning these 3 Senate seats. But Annabelle with Neil O'Sullivan and was it
Walter Cooper, who was the national?
They were 3 out of 33 in the Senate.
Yes, 3 out of 36. So there was 3
out of 36. Yeah, sorry. And the Labor was 33 senators. So she's elected whip of 3, which wouldn't have presumably been too hard. Why was it that things went so well in Queensland and nowhere else? They were very new, the Liberal Party, I guess.
Well, it wasn't even the Liberal Party. It was still the QPP. And maybe it helped having Queensland in the name. I don't know. But it was, the way Porter tells, is that Queensland was just showing Australia the rest of the way. And if you look ahead to the 49 election, there were 18 House of Representatives seats and 15 were won by the Libs or the Country Party. So I think it was Queensland, the tide that came was being manifest a bit earlier in Queensland.
And is there any reason why that was? I mean, you write about how progressive the Queensland pre-selectors were in choosing a Catholic and a woman for these pre-selections, but was Queensland more broadly inclined to favour that side of politics? I mean, certainly these days you look at the LNP does federal level extraordinarily well in Queensland, but in the 1940s, was that trend emerging then, or...?
I think rather than attribute it to, it was very embryonic in terms of the Liberal Party, it was the Country Party. Because don't forget, Artie Fadden was sort of the Queensland leader of the Country Party. He had a very strong personal base in sort of the mid, in Mackay, in the sugar seats. And Sir Walter Cooper, who was the national senator. Of those 3, he was the only one who'd ever been in the parliament before because the other 2 were new. It was a bizarre situation. But so I think it was that strong Country Party influence. Also, Queensland, this may seem like a non sequitur, Queensland was actually much more directly affected by the war than elsewhere in Australia because it was, in effect, an armed camp. Because all the Americans, and that was the base from Brisbane, Townsville, and so on. And it was much more martial law. You'd had all those problems with the conflicts between the American troops and the Australian troops. So maybe that had something to do with it. But although LNP does very well federally, I mean, look at Queensland at the state level. They vote for the Labor Party and it stays there for decades.
Yes.
So it is. Queensland's different.
Indeed. It's a curious state of affairs, isn't it? And then they have people like Joh Bjelke-Petersen as well.
Exactly.
So Annabelle was involved, along with quite a few other women, in the Australian women's movement against socialism. Can you tell me about this group? And we need to, I think, remind our listeners that this was early Cold War. communism was a real concern and the evils of socialism were a real concern for those on the centre-right. Of course, I mean, Chifley's Labor Party was avowedly pro-socialism. That was part of their manifesto. But there was this grouping of women who became quite powerful and influential, and they included Annabelle Rankin and others like Enid Lyons and Nancy Bird, of course, the famous aviatrix.
Aviatrix, yes. They were a very powerful group. Yes, it was anti-socialist, but rallied around bank nationalisation. I mean, don't forget, in 1946 was not good for Menzies. I mean, it got a bloody nose there. He didn't do as well as expected. Only 2 seats were gains. And so while the Labor Party was running into trouble on various things, the real gift was him doggedly pursuing his bank nationalisation. And sure, Enid Lyons, Nancy Bird and Annabelle were the sort of the front people, but the real person who did the hard work was Millicent Preston Stanley. I mean, obviously, she was the sort of the New South Wales equivalent of Elizabeth Couchman in Victoria. Now, I always get the initials wrong. The Australian National, ANWL, isn't it? That's right. Have I got that right?
I think it's the Australian Women's National League. Yeah, I think it's AWNL, but I can...
AWNL, not AN.
But yeah, anyway, one of the very important groups that helps form the Liberal Party in 44, of course.
Of course, yes. And her equivalent in New South Wales, there wasn't as powerful a group as NWL. But Millicent Preston Stanley, who'd been an estate MP, really coalesced and organised the women against socialism. And there were really big meetings they organised. First one was in Sydney, 2,500 people. And it was a women's issue. The bank nationalisation and the thought, it hit home with women. They just simply didn't like it. So women were quite important, I guess, capitalising on what the Liberal Party had recognised late in the war, that there were women's issues, the women could be attracted to vote for the party, and policies like child endowment and so on were important, both electorally and as well as for themselves. The second big meeting was in Canberra at the Albert Hall in 1947. And again, the frontline people were Enid Lyons and Annabelle. Annabelle, of course, wasn't so well known nationally. I mean, Enid Lyons was quite a considerable figure nationally. She'd got in and in 1943 and she spoke all over. She'd been husband's, his sort of warm-up act at heaven knows how many meetings, political meetings throughout Tasmania and later on when he was Prime Minister. So she was a very well-known figure. And Annabelle was starting to become so because obviously she got huge publicity in Queensland and she used to have a weekly column in the Courier Mail. So she was starting to build up there, certainly in Queensland. But it was very early on. The bank nationalisation campaign was pretty early on in her career. In fact, she had to dash from the anti-bank nationalisation meeting at the Albert Hall on one side of Commonwealth Avenue, Albert Hall, back to the Senate to give her maiden speech. She had a very busy day.
And did she speak about bank nationalisation in her maiden speech, Peter?
No, only in passing. In some ways, it was a bit clunky. Maybe she was out of breath, having to have rushed, and she was very, very worried about it. She's very honest and very forthright on things like this, about how nervous she was. She wasn't about the things she didn't want to talk about, like her single state, but she made no hesitation in writing in her column that when she first got into the Senate, the only one of 2 women, the only one on her side, and there's tiny little 3 of them, but also the parliamentary is pretty intimidating. She was very used now to going to public meetings. There you are. Will the candidate now address us? But in the parliamentary chamber, people are walking round. They talk to, members of parliament never realise what an awful impression they make, the way they carry on and talking to each other and laughing loudly and ignoring the speaker. So she was very much aware of that. So she'd prepared her maiden speech very carefully. And what she did, she focused on attacking the Department of Post and Telegraph, partly because it was a very strong women's issue. Queensland women, particularly in the country, couldn't get the phones connected. The postal rate was too high and so on. And so she had a whole list of matters. It was like a political attack right from the get-go. None of your sort of general stuff about speaking about my family and so on. It was right into it. And, of course, the Postmaster General, who was an elderly Labor senator from Queensland, couldn't believe it. He was Senator Cameron. This 37-year-old was right into him. And although they sort of They got on a bit later. So no, she got into it right from the word go.
Well, she was clearly a determined campaigner on a range of issues. But, I mean, the Australian women's movement against socialism, how important were they as a group to Chifley's defeat in 49 and, of course, Menzies' success in 49, do you think?
Well, arguably, the issue was up there with one of the most important issues because it also fed into the whole anti-socialism narrative. Because, of course, he wanted to nationalise the banks and everyone else was fearful about what else was going to be nationalised. Yet it was both important as the probably primary issue itself, and it also fed into that whole anti-socialist narrative, which, of course, was a perfect platform for the more private enterprise, freedom and policies of the incoming coalition government and the Liberal Party. So, yes, it was very, very important, both of itself and what it stood for.
And it's interesting that it was, of course, around women's group that was pushing this. I mean, there were obviously men who were very concerned about socialism and nationalisation of industries, but it was particularly this women's group that took such a strong role in the campaign against it. And you see it, I think, among the first group of female MPs who are getting into federal parliament, obviously not the ones on the Labor side, but the ones on the non-Labor side, they are all linked by this fervent anti-communist sentiment, aren't they, Peter?
Yes, yes. I haven't really seen it explained about why it was such an important women's issue. Why were women seem to be so passionately concerned about the lacks of freedom and so on? It doesn't seem to feed into the issues that women were supposed to be most concerned about, child endowment and education and those sorts of things. But that it happened and that women were particularly concerned about it is clearly a historical fact.
So in the 49 election, obviously there are loads more Liberals elected. So it's not just 3 in the Senate, it's several more. What does that mean for Annabelle Rankin as government whip? Not great, was it?
Not good, no. This was probably a very discouraging and one of the worst periods of her political career because basically she sort of lost the preferments that she had gained from being the opposition whip, and that did not translate into her becoming the government whip. She lost that to an incoming Tasmanian senator called Reggie Wright, and he was a curious choice for whip, which, of course, the one thing a whip has to do is be a loyal servant of the party and help rally the troops, rally the votes as necessary. He went on in his long career to cross the floor on more occasions than any other senator. I think its record still stands about 150 times. He was a rebel.
Whip. He didn't remain whip once he started crossing the floor, I assume.
No, what happened was that he was a real character, actually. It was said of him, I can remember when we were in the Senate, he was still there when I was in the press gallery, and you'd go in the Senate and they used the press gallery joke was that Tasmanians sort of gave him a pair of boots and sent him to Canberra to become a senator. But he did appear to be a rather rough-hewn character, but he quoted poetry. He was very learned on all matters of legislation and parliamentary law, but he was an absolute thorn in the side for his party. And he was also sort of quite gruff and not. And so he was not a good whip in the sense of being collegiate and getting on not only with his own side, but the other side as well. And so quite a few of the Labor senators who'd become quite fond of Annabelle, they wanted her back. There was often remarks in the Senate about when they were attacking, and they said, we want Annabelle back. What happened was that she became the deputy government whip, and Wright was sometimes, very often, it seemed to have to go off on interstate and overseas trips. And so when she was sitting in the chair, she did a good job. And so when the next opportunity came, which was up to re-elect those office holders, which was after the 50 double dissolution election, she was elected. She became whip again, but the government whip. And she held that position. She was very proud of the fact that in the House of Reps, the whip is appointed by the Prime Minister of the day. This is in the Liberal Party. But in the Senate, the whip is selected by a vote of the party. And she was very proud of the fact that she was selected by her colleagues for 15 years. Until she was elevated to the ministry in in 1971.
Yeah, I mean, basically for the rest of the Menzies era, wasn't it, from 51 to 66? So quite an extraordinary tenure in that role. That, of course, meant that she wasn't quite as high profile as she might otherwise have been, given government whips tend to be more of a behind-the-scenes role in making sure that all the party senators are voting as they should be and not crossing the floor like the recalcitrant previous whip from Tasmania.
Her profile didn't drop because she continued to have her weekly column in the Courier Mail. She was continued to be pretty well known in Queensland. I think Neil O'Sullivan became the leader of the government in the Senate. So I'm saying those Liberal Party pre-selectors, they didn't do too badly. No. So there they were. There was Queensland in leader of the government in the Senate and the chief government whip. So pretty good selection decisions. And also, because she was the only woman, she was the most senior. After Enid Lyons retired, because when she wasn't well in 1951, she was the most senior woman, both in the government and in the parliament. And so often, say, for instance, when then Vice President Nixon was visiting Australia and there were functions and dinners and things for him, he would make a particular point how interesting it was that he would meet Annabelle Rankin and how unusual it was to have a woman in this role and so on. So she didn't have the sort of the backseat role, the totally backseat role that you'd expect the whip to have, partly because she was a woman, yeah.
So, Peter, what I find extraordinary and quite a different phenomenon today is that of the first 10 female members of the federal parliament, 8 were from the non-Labor side, from the coalition. So this was really, apart from Dorothy Tangney, who'd been elected at the same time as Enid Lyons, one of the two firsts, the only other non-coalition member of the federal parliament was Doris Blackburn, who was an independent Labor socialist and only lasted one term. Yep. But everyone else was from the Liberal Party or the precursor party. So this is quite an extraordinary phenomenon. They mainly ended up in the Senate. Of course, they would have sat then very closely with Annabelle Rankin. But why do you think the centre-right of politics, and really the Liberal Party, was so good in that early period at pre-selecting and then getting female MPs elected? And as I said, it's quite different today, because what we saw back then was almost no women were getting, aside from Dorothy Tangney, were getting pre-selected for the Labor side of politics. So very much the Liberal Party, Menzies Liberal Party, was seen as a party where women were actually progressing into politics, but also the policies were tended to be seen as more sort of female-focused as well, didn't they?
It was the foresight, I think, of Elizabeth Couchman and the Australian National Women's... Well, am I going to get that right? Keep getting that wrong. AWNL, Australian Women's National League. And Australian National Women's League, because part of the deal for them to become an integral part of the Liberal Party was that they would have pretty well guaranteed positions on the Liberal Party, on the party executives at state level, which made the all-important decisions. And so therefore, they certainly know that the early ones, I mean, it was almost, the word had gone out. It was just about incumbent on them that they had to pre-select women. And that didn't continue all that long, but it certainly informed those early decisions. I mean, those Queenslanders, for instance, were very aware, although they didn't have a women in quite the same way, but the women's branch of what was the QPP, which became the Liberal Party, was very much aware of the national mood to be looking to have women candidates. And it was Enid Lyons had shown the way. There was no question that she was a wonderful exemplar. And so it was possible they were doing that. Now, obviously, this happened in Victoria, which is the home of the very, very strong movement, although it wasn't a Victorian actually until
Ivy Wedgwood in 1950.
In 1949. So they didn't get that first. And South Australia, I also find this a bit strange, South Australia, first policy anywhere to give women the vote, the first woman from South Australia was Nancy Butfield, and that was not until 1955.
Yeah.
This is absolutely strange. You know, everyone says, Liberal Party's got a women problem, as they say now. It's not the Liberal Party, it's New South Wales. The Liberal Party did not return a woman from New South Wales until Bronwyn Bishop in 1987.
That's extraordinary. Wow.
Isn't it? Isn't
Okay.
it?
Not, not a great record, New South Wales. Sorry.
It's not a great record. No. We launched this book at the Liberal Party Women's Convention in Brisbane a couple of months ago. And I hadn't gone that far forward in my work on Annabelle Rankin, but I thought I better look up the different state situations in my talk to that group. And as luck would have it, sitting next to me as I spoke, it was Bronwyn. Bronwyn Bishop. I was able to say in there.
She would have had her views. Quite a formidable woman, formidable politician.
And that also, I'll just go back because you've been mentioning about the socialism. That was also, so Millicent Preston Stanley, who was the great organiser of that very important Australian Women Against Socialism, and she tried several times, but she never got pre-selection after that, although she'd done so much, in fact, to help get the Liberal Party there up in 1949.
Well, I think Menzies even said that Dame Elizabeth Couchman, who obviously is that leading figure in the Australian Women's National League, she was the best cabinet minister he never had because she was never even successful in getting elected to Parliament. So
she didn't know. No, she didn't get no.
So after Menzies' retirement in January 1966, he's obviously succeeded by Harold Holt. Now, Dame Annabelle Rankin is finally appointed to the ministry as Minister for Housing, which, of course, is a massively important role. What didn't have a cabinet rank, but it certainly was a very important portfolio, and the Menzies government itself had really prioritised housing policies throughout the almost 18 years. So tell me about her role as Minister for Housing. She must have been incredibly proud to be in the ministry.
Finally,
yes. She'd only been in Parliament for 19 years by that stage.
I did that time. I'd only been notwithstanding, even she became a minister. She was quite one of the more successful politicians of that era, both male and female, because a lot of men couldn't wait for that. Both Menzies and Holt were very conservative in their appointments, didn't change their ministries very much. And her previous chance had come in 1958. There was going to be a slot for a Queenslander. The year before, she'd got her damehood, or become a dame, I think is probably more accurate. But Menzies passed her over in favour on that occasion, John Gorton. They went for the relatively unknown Victorian man and put him in the ministry, and she missed out yet again, but she rallied around. She had a bit of a sickness at this time too, so it not have been appropriate, but certainly she was expected. She was widely tipped to come in after the 58 election. So she wasn't appointed until Holt's first ministry. Even that, he didn't make many changes. His only two additions were her and another up-and-coming Victorian, Malcolm Fraser. Housing, it was a good choice and a very good fit. In fact, if you look back at her election speeches, housing was a key thing for her, as well as, and that fitted in with what the Liberal policies. Menzies actually, so they set up a separate housing ministry earlier in the 60s. And the first minister was the quite competent but not particularly colourful Les Berry, who went on to become treasurer later. And setting it up was quite difficult. They had to reef the relevant people out of the Treasury Department, which always hated losing anything. And the head of the department was also a Treasury official. Les Berry got it set up, but it was very important to the Liberal Party. And increasingly, because they were looking for young people, the focus that had been there in the 40s and 50s on women had now much more moved to young people. They needed to get the young vote. Now, housing was integral to that because the Labor Party would only ever give money to public housing. They hated the prospect that it was actually going into the private sector. And the Liberal Party had this wonderful policy, first homeowners grant. If you've saved up a certain amount of money in your Commonwealth Bank savings account, you got a £500 government grant. She sold that. She loved it. Tirelessly hopping on planes and trains and so on, travelling around and selling that to young people. There was a lovely pamphlet with her sort of kindly, well, she was not by this stage matronly, might be putting it too much. She was very attractive and she did her hair and she had this quiff, a white quiff in the front of her auburn, her very prominent and much commented on auburn hair. She was a great salesperson for that, what was a very important policy, particularly so in Queensland. And Don Cameron, who became a member, he's still alive. He was the member for Griffith. the seat which became Kevin Rudd's seat and is now held by the Greens, would you believe? What he used to do was when he'd get his staff to troll through the paper, and any time there was a sort of an engagement notice or an announcement of a wedding, he would say, "Oh, congratulations on getting married," or, getting engaged. And by the way, you may be interested in our first homeowners policy.
It's quite a clever campaign tactic. Peter, she obviously was a very competent Minister for Housing, but she suffered the fate of others, such as Malcolm Fraser, when John Gorton was rolled by Billy McMahon in March 1971, and her, over 5 years as Minister for Housing came to an end, and she, along with Malcolm Fraser, were put on the backbench. And really that was, I guess, the time she decided to call it quits from federal parliament. But she went on to have another amazing first, didn't she?
Oh, yes. She went on to be appointed High Commissioner to New Zealand. Again, yet another first woman to hold a diplomatic post of ambassadorial rank. There's a bit of controversy about that. Did she fall or was she pushed? And she was a Gorton person through and through. Not all the Queenslanders, but Jim Killen and most of the Don Cameron were. And she was also, because he'd been the leader of the government, she was she was incredibly loyal to Menzies as her leader. She was very loyal to Gorton because he'd been leader of the government in the Senate. Yeah. So there was never going to be any question. But she was one of the few Liberals members who had a good word to say about Billy McMahon. Oh. Yes.
Well, she was not, no doubt, because he appointed her High Commissioner to New Zealand, I guess.
Indeed. Although it took a long time, because when Billy McMahon became Prime Minister, it was complete chaos because there was a lot of confusion. It took a long time to appoint the ministry. And there was a great expectation that of the Queenslanders, she and Jim Killen were going to be dumped. And after several days, Jim learned his fate. Annabelle didn't know what was going to happen, and she and her staff didn't know what the outcome was. Now, the Honourable William McMahon actually had offered her a diplomatic position when he was Foreign Minister, but the time wasn't right. There were things she wanted to finish off in housing, particularly her signature policy, which was reefing enough money out of the reluctant Treasury Department to have a special category of grant for single pensioners, particularly women. Very much aware that they were left out of those housing commission. And that was huge. She got that. It took about 5 times, but she got it through. I don't think she was looking forward to the prospect of opposition one little bit. She'd been there. She'd been in the parliament nearly a quarter of a century, having to go onto the backbench, and also relished the prospect of a diplomatic posting because she had been sent to lead the Australian delegation for the independence celebrations for Mauritius. And she loved it. Obviously, the only woman leading any of the delegations. And so she was the whole diplomatic role, absolutely loved it. She was looking forward. It's suggested in the recent McMahon biography, or relatively recent one, Tiberius with the Telephone, that in fact she was sort of shoved unwillingly. It was a consolation prize. But for her, she was very happy. She just about had enough, and she was very happy looking forward to a diplomatic post. And so it was the crowning glory of her career rather than a consolation prize that she was. And don't forget, many of those ministers, including your grandfather, who went on to be, or Joe Gullett, ambassador to Greece, Hubert Opperman, immigration minister before your grandfather, went High Commissioner to Malta, your father High Commissioner to London. It was a well-oiled path. Yes. And for her as the first woman to go to New Zealand as High Commissioner was very much in the groove.
And a prestigious post as well. Well, Peter, that was a lovely, lovely discussion on such a significant figure in Australian history about Annabelle Rankin, a woman who had many firsts in her own life and in the Australian political history. And of course, she's now remembered in the federal electorate of Rankin, held by the Treasurer of Australia today, Jim Chalmers. I'm not sure if she would be so satisfied about his version of politics, but I mean, a discussion for another day, I'd say. But Peter, it's been an absolute delight to have you on Afternoon Light, and I've really enjoyed this chat.
Good, thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook.